Hello and welcome everyone to today's UBIG, #UBIGNOW People's Assembly. I'll be chairing today's engagement. My name is Awande Buthelezi and I am an organizer and researcher at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. And I'd like to begin firstly with a background with regards to our process and the timeline to how we have arrived at today's presentation. Last year we began in the height of COVID and the lockdown period with engagements across grassroots forces and civil society actors with regards to the question of a universal basic income grant and how it would look and what is needed with regards to understanding the various ways in which it can look. And we began processes of engaging with a wide variety of people representing different constituencies and groups and walks of life across our country to come together and speak around a consensus around what a UBIG now would look like. This was followed by a series of videos, monthly videos from different perspectives, labor, youth, environmental, beginning to speak about where people gave their thoughts and understandings on what a UBIG would mean for them and their lives where they are and across the different groups that they represented. And this carried on from June all the way through towards the end of the year, capturing a variety of diverse perspectives. And then we continued this with also further engagements around what a technical consensus around a UBIG would look like. And at the start of this year, we've hosted a workshop with heterodox thinkers, Dr. Adelzadeh, who is with us today, at the IEJ, and Hein Murray, where they gave perspectives around what a UBIG could look like in South Africa, giving life and understanding to how feasible it is and the reality of what it could do in terms of transforming people's lives in this country. And out of that workshop, we put together the policy approach and scenarios documents, which we can now say is finally at its full completion with Dr. Adelzadeh's presentation today. That document was released just before the budget speech at the start of the year, and we've been beating the drum around how our government, now that the COVID-19 grants have ended, has done very little with regards to expressing the ways in which we can expand to. I was kicked out of the Zoom, but now I'm back. So as I've said, I will not take up any more time. We will begin with the launch of our UBIG animation before moving on to Dr. Adelzadeh's presentation on scenarios. And now we can move on with the UBIG animation. Thank you very much.
Our government has not fixed the structural legacies of apartheid and colonialism. This has only further worsened the frequency of violent protests, racial tensions, and gender-based violence. We have an escalating food crisis with 30 million people across the country facing food stress. The COVID relief grant of 350 Rand per person per month does not come anywhere near relieving the pressures of daily life. As a country, we desperately need a solution to the high levels of poverty, inequality, declining wages, and permanent unemployment. But thankfully, there is a way out. The Universal Basic Income Grant. A non-means tested, guaranteed resource transfer given to all living in South Africa. A UBIG is a basic income grant that would ensure that each person in this country is provided with an economic cushion. The higher the amount, the more transformative the UBIG will be. 584 Rand a month would lift everyone in the country above the food poverty line. 840 Rand a month would raise each individual above the lower boundary poverty line. 2,500 Rand a month would raise us above the upper boundary poverty line. And 7,500 Rand a month would mean that everyone in this country could be afforded a decent standard of living. The UBIG would be subject to progressive taxation if the recipient's income exceeds 20,000 Rand per month, for example. This means the wealthy will not benefit. After lockdown, an estimated 16 million people are unemployed, and this trend is only increasing. Providing a basic income will ensure a cushion for millions currently jobless. 18 million people in South Africa live in abject poverty. Of this demographic, 5 family members have to survive off of 2,600 Rand per month. A universal basic income will cause a nationwide increase in household income and boost fiscal stimulus. Hunger was a challenge before COVID-19 and has been worsened during the pandemic. In 2019, 19 million people went to bed hungry. The future years do not have to be the same. With a UBIG, there will be solidarity in households, and the resource transfers will enable dignity. Every citizen in this country can get the basic necessities and nutritional support required to sustain life. A UBIG will sever people's dependence on low-wage labor, giving them the freedom to pursue a life that has meaning, to invest in their own development, and to do work that fulfills them. With the basic necessities for survival protected, each member of this country will be given the opportunity to pursue the life they choose, not the one that economic circumstance has dictated for them. Moreover, with the worsening climate crisis, the UBIG will be a cushion against climate harms and will assist workers trapped in carbon-based industries to transition to climate jobs. It is crucial for climate justice. But how can the UBIG be financed? Recoup the UBIG from those with high taxable income. Tax those with middle, high, and very high incomes on a sliding scale. Tax wealth and income from wealth. Limit tax breaks for those with higher incomes. Cancel ineffective corporate tax breaks. Tax environmentally damaging behavior. End corruption. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign initiated the UBIG Now initiative, and the Climate Justice Charter and movement is also calling for UBIG Now as part of the deep, just transition. A universal basic income is for all, black, white, old and young. The time has come to build an emancipatory future.
The animation is live on YouTube, and the link will be shared in the chat for all. So please share freely in your networks and across so that we can get this message and help educate people to understanding the reality of what the UBIG can be and how it can change many lives. For those who have joined us now since the beginning, I'm just going to speak through the agenda, and then I will hand over to Dr. Adelzadeh to begin his presentation. So now we will have Dr. Adelzadeh's presentation, which will be followed by a discussion section and then concluding remarks by Dr. Vishwa Sadka. So now I hand over to you, Dr. Adelzadeh, for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone, and thanks for your time. I hope you can see my presentation. I'm trying to get it all worked out. I assume you can see my screen now, the presentation, which is titled Fiscally Neutral Basic Income Grant Scenarios, Economic and Development Impacts. This has been an exciting project following the work we did on impact of COVID and the scenarios for recovery that was launched in February. In there, we developed a 6-pillar program, a framework as an alternative to the current business as usual scenario. and to not only mitigate the impact of the COVID, but also put the South Africans on a path that will deal with the chronic crisis of high poverty, high unemployment rate, and high inequality, and also low growth rates. One of the pillars of that six pillar scenarios framework is social policy program, and in there we examined, we talked about the need to expand social security, and there we talked about the unemployment grants and others. Now the project that came from this from COPAC to examine scenarios on basic income grant expanded basically that pillar, social policy pillar discussion to see what if we include basic income grants. So we raise a number of questions and try to answer these using the modeling work that we do. Basically, we raise a number of questions. One is, what if all unemployed receive basic income grant, or all adults receive basic income grant? What if all South Africans receive basic income grant, and what if the amount of the grant is equivalent to food poverty line, or the lower bound poverty line, or the upper bound poverty line? And then we wanted to see, well, if we're answering these questions, what would be who will be the main beneficiary of introducing a basic income grant in South Africa? What would be the impact of a big on poverty, inequality, unemployment rate, and what would be the impact on households' income, economic growth, government finances? So these are the questions we try to answer, and the approach that we took, we use is basically we design these number of basic income grant scenarios and use the ADRS's, one of ADRS's models to basically simulate the impacts of these different scenarios over the next 5 years, and then analyze these scenarios, compare and contrast the results. So that's I'm going to try to summarize that work for you today and answer any questions that you may have. Be happy to hear your comments and suggestions. So starting with it, with the model that we use for this project. Basically, we use economic modeling techniques, which is basically trying to build a replicate of the working of the South African economy, a model that captures the laws of motion of the economy, the private sector, households, production, labor markets, financial sector, using time series data and a combination of heterodox theory, time series data, statistical analysis, computer programming come together to develop a replicate of a working of the economy. And that through that statistical analysis of finding out what determines household consumptions or employment in different sectors, or wage rates, or productions, or investments, or exports and imports, these determinants that are being found statistically link different parts of the economy together, make the interdependence, capture the interdependency within the economy as it captures, as it's shown here in diagrammatically through these arrows between different blocks of equations that are that capture these different parts of the economy. The reason we use this model is that because it's not only a macroeconomic model, capture the working of the macroeconomy, but also includes a macro simulation model, which is basically an individual household level model that is looking at the impact of policies on taxations, on demand for social security, cost of social security, poverty and inequality at individual and household level. So it captures, therefore, by integrating these two models, a macroeconomic model, which is the this larger part of this and the macro simulation part of model, then the economy impact, we can be able to capture the impact of the changing the direction of the economy. If the economy become more job creating, better paid, or it distribute that among the unemployed, it impacts demand for social security, it impacts poverty inequality, and aggregates it and feed it back into the macroeconomy. So that two-way relationship between the macroeconomy and the welfare of the population, and the feed between the two of them is enables us to look at the diverse impact of these scenarios that are, for example, starting with here, basic income grant, introducing it for individuals and households. How does it impact the economy? And that will again come back affect the households and individuals. So this is a model, the replicate that we use to develop, to simulate the impact of various scenarios. So going from here, that using this as a tool, then the question is, what are the scenarios that we have? How do we do this thing? And the scenarios, we're starting with what is called a baseline scenario, which is basically a scenario without the basic income grant. And that gives us where would the economy go? What would be the outlook for the economy without the basic income grant? And then so when we introduce the basic income grant, we can compare it to baseline scenario and see what difference that basic income grant scenarios make. So for the baseline scenario, here is basically, in other words, the baseline scenario includes the impact of, in our case here, includes the impact of COVID, and assumes that the recent past economic policies will continue over the next 5 years. So the COVID, we have captured that the impact of the COVID basically relates to the impact of the domestic and international spillover effects, the measures, the close downs, the impact on household consumptions and employment, others, and also the impact on trade, on FDI and others on the economy. We have captured that in the report that we did on the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy. So the baseline scenario says, well, it includes COVID, and it assumes the macroeconomic policy remains as before. The government investment expenditure grows annually by 6% in nominal terms. Consumption expenditure grows annually by 7.5% annually. In the past, now the government wants reducing that significantly under the austerity program. Investment by public corporations annually assumes grows annually by 6%, and monetary policy remains strictly adhering to the inflation targeting. It also, the baseline scenario assumes that social policy basically remain as it has been. Phase 4 of the EPWP will include no change to the phase 3. The social security program remains unchanged, and no new major social policies are being introduced over the next 5 years. So that gives us basically some of the elements of the key elements of the baseline scenario to run the model and see where, without the basic income grant, where the economy goes. And I will see that we will look at the results of this scenario later on. Now, to this scenario, to this baseline scenario, then say, well, what if we change the social security part and introduce basic income grant? Now, the question becomes then, what are the scenarios for basic income grant that we have considered? We've considered, what happened? We've considered 9 scenarios for the basic income grant. It includes 3 unemployed basic income grants, which is basically designed for all those who are broadly defined as unemployed by Stats SA, and the scenarios are similar in terms of their eligibility conditions, but they differ in terms of their entitlement. And the eligibility for this grant is that people who are eligible for it should be between 18 and 59 years old, should fall under the Stats SA's broadly unemployed category, should not be receiving any other grants, and should not be in school. And then all other grants also remain as they are, continue over the next 5 years as they are. in terms of the entitlement conditions, the three scenarios, unemployed grants basically pay equivalent or either equivalent of the food poverty line or lower bound poverty line or upper bound poverty line. So three scenarios of the amount of grants, and the grants will go into effect in 2021 and adjust annually by 5%, and all other grants also adjust to inflation. So here we said, well, what if the basic income grants is introduced only for unemployed, broadly defined unemployed? We also looked at a scenario for basic income grant that says, well, what if the grant is for all adults in South Africa, and the three scenarios basically includes eligibility condition will be everyone who are between 18 and 59 years old, and all current grants will continue also as they are. And in this case also we considered the adult basic income grant paying poverty line, food poverty line, and lower bound and upper bound poverty line, and also again going into effect 2021, and the grant amount adjusting annually by 5%. So three scenarios on all adults 18 to 59, and the three scenarios also then we said, well, what if the basic income grant is given to everyone in South Africa, all the population of South Africa as it measured by the Stats SA. What would be we wanted to see the impact of them. So here, again, we considered the universal basic income grant receiving either the food poverty line or lower bound or upper bound poverty line, again, starting 2021, and the amount adjusting annually. And in this case, all other grants except child support grant will continue. So the child support grant gets subsumed in the universal basic income grant in this case. So these are the 9 scenarios on the basic income grants that we used to run the model for. But we had to, in order to run the model going forward to between 2020 to 2025, we needed to know what are those poverty lines that are exogenous or that will be used in the for the model scenarios. And currently we have the latest value we have for Stats SA is poverty line, the 3 poverty lines for 2020. We looked at the data from Stats SA over the last 7-8 years. Took an average annual growth rate, it came to about 5%. So we assume that each poverty line will grow annually by 5%, and therefore created. So as the model runs, for example, for 2023, then the food poverty line will be used as 677, the lower bound will be 972, and the upper bound will be 1,468 rand. So that's we needed that as an input into the model as well as an assumptions that we needed to make. Then we had this slide was misplaced. Then there were also an important part of this scenarios was also, well, how do these the basic income grants is going to be recouped or paid by who is going to pay for this? So on the one hand, as I mentioned, the baseline scenario assumes that macroeconomic assumptions that we made earlier for the baseline scenario will be the same across all the basic income grant scenarios. And then it assumes that the scenarios assume that the main targets of these new grant scenarios or the basic income grant scenarios are individuals and households in the bottom quantiles. And that the top quantiles are expected to bear basically the overall cost of the new grants. Therefore, the new grant is designed to be fiscally neutral as possible, which is expected to be achieved through a mix of tax measures, wealth tax, land tax, financial transaction tax, income tax, export tax, any combination of these, so that they to collect basically the amount that is paid to the bottom quintile. This is very important in terms of the mechanism that we have suggested and how to how it works. Basically, one, the bottom two quintiles will receive the new grant with no changes to their income and wealth tax liabilities. So the bottom 40% of households receive during the simulation will receive the grant with no changes in their tax liability. Then individuals from the third quintile that will receive the new grant will return the equivalent amount to the state through adjustments of their income and wealth tax. So basically, the middle, the third quintile, 20% of households, what they receive as a from the basic income grant, they pay back through adjustments of their taxes. Then the top two quintiles that will receive the new grant will return more than the equivalent amount to the state through adjustments of their income and wealth taxes. A mix of those taxes. The increase in the tax liability of the top quintiles, therefore, means that they pay not only the amount they directly receive, but also the amount paid to the bottom two quintiles. So what we have is that the top two quintile households, the top 40% households, pay back what they receive and also pay back to the government, to their adjustments of taxes, what the bottom two quintiles or the bottom 40% of households receive. And in that way, it will make it the overall the increase in government spending on the new grant is modeled, therefore, to match the increase in its income and wealth tax revenue. Okay. So that's then this is the approach. This is how we modeled, wrote the code, and adjusted the taxes and tax liability taxation for the different individuals in different quintiles in order to allow for the big to government to spend, but at the same time to be able to recoup the amount from the top quintiles. So given the close equivalence between the each scenario's injection into the household income of the bottom two quintiles and leakage from the households of the top two quintiles, therefore total household disposable income in terms of growth income minus the taxation is not expected to grow that differently across scenario. So that's also very important. We are injecting, the government injects the basic income grant amount into the economy. And then it changes the taxations of the top quintiles, we take it back. So the amount that gets injected, it gets taken out at the same time. So the net effect of this will be in terms of impact on overall total household income is different. At individual level, the growth, the disposable income changes, but not at the total calculation of the growth income. Therefore, it is therefore important to recognize that the proposed basic income grant scenarios are mainly designed as an anti-poverty, anti-inequality, or redistributive measures that are expected to have limited growth and employment impact. The money that is injected doesn't remain in the economy as a total, it's being taken out of the economy. But those who are at the bottom two quintiles, because they keep that, it affects it impacts them significantly. But as a total household's disposable income, it is in the band unchanged. And in that sense, the macroeconomic impact of the overall basic income become limited, as opposed to a scenario where the amount that is distributed into the economy is given as a result of basic income remain there and not being recouped. Therefore, notwithstanding this point, noting this point, however, the model simulation takes into account the difference in consumption behavior of households across quintiles. And that means that the model does quantify the extent to which the differences between increase in income of the bottom quintile and the top decrease in the income of the top quintile lead to differential growth and employment across scenarios. So we take account of the model shows the impact of the breakdown of the total income as a result of the basic income grant. So we will see that in the results. So this part is important in terms of how we prepared the model to run the scenarios of the basic income, and at the same time that it runs the scenarios, the distribute, and at the same time the tax policies implement the tax, the impact of the scenario about the adjustments of the tax liability of the top quintile, so that the scenario as it goes from one year to the next is this mechanism of distribution, the outlays and receipts are captured. So now show you the results of this scenarios. Starting with the baseline scenario, basically, if with no basic income grant, what the model shows is that the economy, as you can see, this is in terms of GDP growth, drops due to the COVID and gradually starts going back to basically to the past trend. The same thing with the unemployment rate; it jumps up from about 29% to about 34%, but by 2025, still the unemployment rate would be 27.7%. Poverty rate also jumps to 38.8% with COVID, and over the next 5 years gradually declines, but by 2025, still more than 1/3 of the population will be poor, and the depth of poverty also increases to 13.3% in 5 years, still will be 11.2. The key part, what we find is that the basic over time economic indicators tend to gravitate towards the past low growth, high unemployment, and high poverty rate that's established by the policy status quo. So the BIG is being now introduced to this to see how does it especially impacts the poverty and inequality, the overall economic impact. So the next, when we look at the impact of the basic income grant scenarios, the first set of impact is to see, well, the number of beneficiaries and its distributions. And as you can see here, in total, under the unemployed grants, the number of the beneficiaries would be, if you have unemployed grants, would be about 8.9 million by 2021 and 8.4 million 2025. Even though the population grows, labor force grows, but because the economy come out of the COVID creates more jobs, it drops the number of the beneficiaries of the grants gradually drops to 8.4 million by 2025. However, for the adult grants, which is all 1859, it will increase with the population from 35.2 million to about 35.1 million. And for the universal basic income grant, which is everyone in South Africa, would be the population of South Africa would be 59.5 million to 62.2 million by 2025. So that is the numbers that every year, as the model projects, as the model runs, simulates, these are the numbers in terms of total beneficiary, number of beneficiaries. And it also, in terms of breaks down by gender, by race, by quintile, by urban, rural, you can see that in terms of the distribution of this, in terms of allocation among who are the beneficiaries. Starting with the impact, looking at the impact on poverty rate, and here, we move this thing here, by starting with the poverty rate. So relative to the baseline scenario, we'll see that the unemployed, if you look at the baseline scenario, without basic income grant, the percentage change in the poverty rate between 2020 to 2025, this will be reflected in the baseline scenario, about 25% decline, and across different different cohort of the population. With the unemployed grants and adult grants and basic income and universal grants, the impact on the poverty rate is highly significant. So relative to this baseline scenario, the unemployed basic income grant will potentially lower poverty rate by an additional 15 percentage points. So as you can see here, with the upper bound poverty line scenario for unemployed, the unemployment rate, the poverty rate declines by 40%. As opposed to 25%, or for the urban area, it would be 57% decline, or for the for various groups, and for the adult grants, it even would be much larger. So decline in the poverty rate, and all the way that we will see it's even more effective in reducing poverty when there is a universal basic income grant. For example, here, if we have the scenario of the universal basic income grant that pays the upper bound poverty line, then it will eliminate poverty rate, because in the model, the poverty rate also is calculated based on the poverty line of the upper bound poverty line. It has a potential from a baseline scenario of having in 5 years to having about 1/3 of the population in poverty to zero poverty rate. Basically income poverty rate, depending on which scenario of the basic income we consider. So that's captured in the graph. Here is the baseline scenario. Here is the universal basic income grant paying upper bound poverty line, which will be zero poverty rate. And in between, as you can see, there's a decline as a reduction in the poverty rate. In terms of poverty gap, depth of poverty, same also, you find out that there's a significant impact. It can make a significant difference in terms of depth of poverty. The baseline scenario decline will be double and all the way to 100% elimination of the depth of poverty, the poverty gap, depending on which basic income grant is used. So you have a major impact on the depending on the scenario, from the baseline scenario, which by 2025 you still have about 10%. The poverty gap is about 10%, to a scenario where it will decline to about 2%, 3%, or 0%. And these are hugely significant. I mean, to have within short period of time eliminating poverty rate and poverty gap, these are huge. In terms of income inequality, Gini coefficient, same again, we'll see that the Gini coefficient in the baseline scenario declining over the next 5 years. Starting Gini coefficient is declining by baseline scenario by about 8%, 5, 6, 7%, and to all the way from with the unemployment grant. That decline, there would be larger decline, and all the way to about 18% to between 15 and 22% decline in the Gini coefficient. So as a result, you can see that by 2025, the Gini coefficient in baseline scenario would be 64%, but by with the basic income grant, universal basic income grant, would be about 57%. Gini coefficient is much larger to reduce, much harder to reduce, and over the 5 years, reducing it by that much is highly significant. In terms of, so these are in terms of the three key poverty rate impact, depth of poverty, and inequality. In terms of its impact, fiscal impact is also captured here, where the requirement that the government annual spending on basic income grant scenario be fully recouped through increases in income and wealth tax of the top quintiles translates to basically concurrent increases of both expenditure GDP ratio and revenue GDP ratio, with no deterioration of deficit GDP ratio and debt GDP ratio. And I want to elaborate that in the, there's a category in the national income accounts called the social benefits paid by government, which includes, which captures the grant payments on the social grants. And the baseline scenario, average annual payment between 2021 2025 is 300 billion rand, which is broken down between 189 on social grants, about 111 for other grants. So the government without basic income grant is projected to spend about 300 billion. With the basic income grants, this amount changes from 300 billion all the way to 1.3 trillion, depending on which basic income grant you're considering. And the way it breaks down is that the amount on the current grants amounts, how much it will be, and also the new grant, initially zero with baseline scenario, no basic income, and gradually depending on unemployment grant costs with food poverty line, 70 billion, all the way to 150 billion on if it pays upper bound poverty line, and goes up all the way to universal basic income grant that on average annually cost about 497 billion to 1 trillion, 1.1 trillion. So it's a major increase as a result of the amount that is being paid into the social benefits government pays will significantly increase. But as it is the tax revenue also, as a result of that, the recouping of it from the bottom, from the top quintile, and also the third quintile paying back what it receives, then the government revenue also increases from 1 trillion currently average over the next 5 years under the baseline scenario to 2.1 trillion. And relative to GDP, therefore, what we have here is that the expenditure GDP ratio and the baseline scenario of about 33.8% of the GDP is spent on government total expenditure gradually, as a result of basic income grant, depending on the scenario, increases from 34.8% to 45.7%, depending on the scenario. This sharp increase as a result of the basic income grant on expenditure is also, you'll see that on the government revenue also increases from 30.7%, as you can see, all the way to 45.3%, depending on the scenario. So you have this concurrent of expenditure GDP ratio going up and revenue GDP ratio going up. At the same time, the tax collection, that the mechanism we discussed. As a result, the difference between the two is your deficit GDP ratio. And as a result, your deficit GDP ratio remains stable. As before, here is the baseline scenario of average of -3% annually, and remains more or less the same. And the debt GDP ratio, because the deficit is not increasing, is also not increasing as a result. So this is very important part of that, making it fiscally neutral is also captured in terms of numbers, what it means in terms of, I explained in terms of how the taxation is supposed to work, but in terms of numbers also the macro simulation component of the model also changes the tax liability of the top quintile and the bottom of the middle quintile in order to establish this the mechanism that we discussed. So as a result, you can see in this graph the debt GDP ratio and the deficit GDP ratio of so this, you can have this basic income grant scenario, any of these scenarios, as far as the fiscal side of it, it can be made to become fiscally neutral. Now, these numbers are I'm not emphasizing the drop in the, we're not saying that the deficit GDP ratio declines as a result of basic income grant, or the debt GDP ratio declines, even though these numbers showing that decline. It is that adjustment of taxes. The main thing is that the taxes that needs to happen in the model. It's not that easy to calibrate them to be exact in the model. But the main thing is that these both the revenue and the expenditure side will be adjusted to capture, basically recoup what is being spent by the government. This is a dynamic endogenous determinants in the model. That's a result of a number of various factors, and in that sense it's not possible to make them exact in terms of, so that the deficit GDP ratio remains exactly the same over time. But the mechanism works really nicely in that sense. In terms of macroeconomic impact, here the key part of the basic income grant is impact on disposable income. That's why we have it much more detailed. But then, since we said that the disposable income is as a total, if you look at it, doesn't grow that much because what is being injected and taken out, average annual growth rate is not that significantly different. But when you look at inside that disposable income, and you're looking at, for example, the bottom two quintile, you'll see that the average annual growth rate grows for the bottom two quintile from about 14% annually annual growth to 24.7%, almost double the average annual growth, because they're the one that keep the money that is being paid to them, increase their income without paying it back, and they're the main beneficiaries. So same thing when you're looking at urban and rural, you see that average annual growth of their disposable income. With the basic income grants, you'll see that the rural areas, especially, their average annual disposable income growth of the disposable income grows faster than before. So the total disguises otherwise the what is happening, that redistribution and that increase in the well-being and the standard of living of the bottom quintiles and the rural, for example, areas and others. And as a result of this, we also, this redistribution that is also even in total, even though in the total disposable income is the same, but because it is biased towards the bottom quintiles, and the bottom quintiles has higher propensity to income, to consumptions per land income. They almost spend entirely rather than save. That puts it back in the economy and has a dynamic impact on the growth. So even though there is no government injection, net injection, the spending, the bias toward the bottom quintile also helps economic growth. And the larger is that grant amount or scenario, the basic income grant amount is, the larger is that support for the for community development, growth of rural areas and others that will help average growth rate of the economy. So we basically have the conclusions of this. The summarizing is that we use the modeling to do this, simulate, to design scenarios and see the impact, a number of scenarios. And we showed that the South African government can introduce basic income grant program that targets both poverty and inequality, that is concurrently fiscally neutral. And depending on the choice of scenario and relative to the baseline scenario, a basic income grant program can significantly lower income inequality and eradicate poverty in South Africa. It is undoubtedly a pro-poor social policy program. And even though by design the scenario do not provide, this design the way we have it, they do not provide a new net injection into the economy, the scenarios biased towards poor households have positive impact on growth and employment. And finally, the main challenge, that means basically the main challenge to introducing basic income grant in South Africa, given the government's antipathy toward debt financing, is whether the state is willing to adopt a set of tax measures that increases the overall tax liability of the top quintiles, the non-poor, in order to recoup the overall cost of a big program that is designed to benefit the bottom two quintiles households, basically, or the poor. I leave it there. Thank you very much. I finished there. I'm sorry that it took so long.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I think we've still done well with time regardless of the technical glitch. And now we will be moving on to our discussion section. And if you have yet to see in the chat, I've just written, please post any questions you may have in the chat. And if it's something that is longer, you may need to explain better, then we can give you speaking functionality also, but just raise your hand also. I'd just like to begin with the question that I see here to pose this question to Dr. Adelzadeh. There was a question around the need to deal with a decrease in investment to get the general equilibrium effect on growth or employment. And the question also asked on whether this came from a wage-led growth parameter. Unfortunately, I see that Ihsan has left, who posed the question. But do you have anything more to speak on that decrease in investments?
I didn't say anything about decrease in investment in the scenarios. This is but the concept of wage-led growth is partly the case here in terms of if we look at basic income grant as basically increasing income as the way increasing wages does, not through employment but through transfers. So this is basically demand, increasing demand in the economy through the bottom two quantiles. But remember, the top quantile demand declines because of the increase in their taxes. So, but the bottom two quantiles demand increases and their spending is higher. The grant that they receive from government, they spend more than the top quantile, spending. So in that sense, it will stimulate the economy from the demand side. So this scenario keeps the baseline scenario for macro the same. It doesn't inject, with the basic income grant, doesn't inject new investment in the economy. It keeps everything else the same. The only thing it changes from baseline scenario is the introduction of basic income grant. And that's why you want to use the model basically, because you want to be able to isolate the impact of your scenario. So if we obviously, as I mentioned about the study we did for the 6-pillar program for the framework for the COVID recovery, you can have introduced with the basic income grant other measures, increase in government, for example, infrastructure spending, or changes in macroeconomic policy, changes in monetary policy components or fiscal policy component or industrial policy, and have a much more comprehensive. I suggest if you look at the report that we have on COVID, that will give you more of like the broader, set of policies that are needed. This is in terms of focusing only on social policy. What if we change social grant program to include basic income grant? It's very narrow in that sense.
The next question I see here is, would it be fair to say that the stimulatory impact does not show in the model as the model doesn't provide for the shift in spending?
No, that's not correct. That's not correct. What we have done is actually, I think it's important to realize, a lot of time people talk about basic income grant and they say, look, that grant will stimulate local. They don't talk about the collection of the money they only talk about injection or consider only the injection in the economy, not the leakage that is coming from the collection of the raising taxes. What we have done is that we have considered both. We have considered injection and also what does it mean? Are we going to recoup it or just government has to come up with that money and spend it and no taxes changes? Nobody pays for it. Well, I don't think anyone is saying that we will introduce universal basic income grant without recouping that the cost. So you have to look at that at the balance. But when you do not look at the tax policy, tax part of it, it looks like a lot of money is being spent in the economy. It will create a lot of growth. It will create a lot of employment. It will be looked at as being a silver bullet for the economy. In reality, is that the discussion on basic income always talks about taxation, changes in taxations for the upper income to pay for it. And here we have done that. And that when you bring that in, that means you're injecting into the local economic development, your rural areas, your bottom quintiles, and poor communities. But at the same time, you're taking the money out. So the net effects of it is the model looks at, and therefore that's why we're saying that the overall basic income grant should be looked at as, when we consider both the injection and the taxation, as an anti-poverty and inequality. It is not. It is. I think its impact on growth and employment is not as much as in relationship to the amount that is being spent. It's not the best way to get the in other words, necessarily the growth going, but it's one of the best ways to get the poverty and inequality reduced, eradicate poverty or depth of poverty and inequality. So I think it's very important, that aspect, that misconception of basic income being both dealing with the poverty, dealing with growth, dealing with employment, as if like that is the silver bullet, and it has to be measured. We need to be fully consider the entire proposal of basic income grant, and that's what we have done. And in that sense, I would say that the question was, I would say, is not correctly formulated.
The next question we have from Duma is, please explain why it must be fiscally neutral. Does that not undermine stimulus? I understand the reallocation of spend effect, but surely it can't be that large.
Okay, it's a good question. Look, making it fiscally neutral, it doesn't mean that's look, we have two extremes. We can have 100% fiscally neutral. So basic income grant, whatever is spent, we get taxation to get it back. And it can be 100% total spending of the basic income grant and no taxation, right? So the reality can be somewhere between the two. So you're right in the sense of it can, if we want to increase the stimulus component of basic income grant. In other words, if we want to use basic income grant also as being stimulating the economy more than what we showed, then it doesn't need that upper income, the top quartile doesn't, or the third quintile maybe also do not recoup, allow them to have some of that injection. We leave it more in the economy to revibrate and help economic growth. So it's that consensus that need to be built. But given that we looked at this, fiscally neutral, given what the antipathy of the government to debt and this fundamentalist approach that they have, we said, well, even with your own kind of frame of thinking, you still can look at basic income grant seriously and introduce basic income grant. It all depends on whether you're prepared to step on, and step up and introduce a mix of taxation. So you're right. It can be more a stimulus if it leaves some of that injection, more of it in the economy, and that's just by choice. I mean, that's a calibrating which what can the economy tolerate. Right now, we're showing that look, you can really, if you really fiscal hawk and you want to have your deficit, deficit GDP ratio absolutely not going above 60%. Your deficit GDP ratio remains below 3%. We give it to you. You can do it. And still eradicate poverty, reduce the debt GDP ratio, reduce the inequality, and even eradicate the depth of poverty. You still can do, but you need to look at the taxation and the rich who have become richer over the last 25 years. They have to pay for that. So the cost of that being fundamentalist on your deficit should be paid by actually the most proponent of that policy, because it's the business who is pushing that line to government as well. So let them pay for the basic income grant in that sense.
To follow on the topic of taxation, there's a comment and question from Neil. begin with the comment that the main challenge to introducing a big program in South Africa, given the government's antipathy towards debt financing, is whether the state is willing to adopt a set of tax measures that increases the overall tax liability of the top quintiles in order to recoup the overall cost of a big program. And in light of this, shouldn't we be considering leveraging finance or borrowing in addition to taxation, particularly in the short term, as other medium-term measures are rolled out, such as wealth tax?
I'm fine with that. I think it's similar to what Duma has also raised. Again, it's that spectrum of where do we, where the consensus can lie, negotiating that consensus. It can be, in my own personal view as economist, I think it can be partly debt finance. It can be managed, not fully, but a combination as suggested. But I think that's the calibrating between the two extremes, not completely through borrowing, pay everything without any raise in taxes, just everything paid by borrowing, or everything is paid through taxations and no borrowing and no implication for debt or deficit. I think that it can be it can be the final kind of like a program, can be the mix of taxations and a short-term financing. All of that mechanism can work. It's not we just highlighting that. Even I think it's like we are pushing the in these scenarios, we could easily show we can, there's no need to really do intermediary steps. We can be showing that it is possible to make this thing fiscally neutral. It doesn't mean it's necessary to be fiscally neutral. That's different. But if Treasury says, whatever you do, it has to be fiscally neutral, well, we can do that still. Now, anything less than that is still obviously possible. That's always on the table, the other issues. But it is addressing those who said, no, we cannot do it because it has, fiscal impact of it, fiscus impact of it.
The next question is, can quantitative easing contribute to financing a UBIG now as one possible option, similar to what's happening with cash transfers in the United States?
Yes. If South African, government was open to it, that is, it is, it comes to view of the monetary policy and role of money. Right now, we have a very conservative dispensations in South Africa. Not right now, we have had, that has been the case since 1999. So but it is, yes, it's quantitative easy or borrowing, as Neil was also referring to, or Duma was suggesting about. All of that, also I agree with. This is not a position I'm saying that the paper is not to say that fiscally neutral is the only way to do it. It is again making it even that we can make the necessity and the need of the basic income grant, and it's the potential of it, more real even under the current circumstance. But I am, very much things in terms of, those suggestions. I think they also, it doesn't mean also 100% pay that way, or, I think there is definitely need for some taxation. South Africa needs wealth tax. There is a need for considering land tax. There's a need for considering taxations on financial transactions. I mean, we're dealing also with the inequality, huge inequality that needs to be addressed. So a mix of these, I think, needs to be looked at, and including, government financing it, whether it's debt financing, quantitative easing, money supply, which is same as money supply increase. Yes, That's
So
my
taking into consideration your statement on that we do need, or it would be more beneficial to have a mix of these different funding or revenue options. There's a specific criticism within the discourse around UBIG or universal basic income, which states that linking or pegging the taxation, the funding of a UBIG, in linking it to punitive taxes such as wealth taxes or land taxes, or for example, a carbon tax, in the long term could undermine the feasibility of a BIG, particularly with regards to something such as, let's say, a carbon tax, where the point of a carbon tax is to foster a decrease in emissions. And once the transition has occurred, where the amount of taxation that could be potentially gained from a carbon tax has diminished, then you lose that whole stream of revenue. So do you have any thoughts around some of those kind of critiques?
I think they need to be more more precise than that. I think it's putting a lot of apple and oranges together, it seems. Based on what I heard, I may have heard it wrongly. I think carbon tax, I mean, it is, it's a company tax. That is a company taxes, and relating to use of energy. It's complicated in that sense, but it is not the same as we can, those that I don't think it will reduces the chance of introducing carbon tax. Look, I think the main arguments is that the people who are well-to-do and then they don't like the taxes increase, they will, I already saw some article in the paper about wealthy leaving the country. I think that's what we probably will hear more about. Not that we're going to be paying taxes, but we would like to be pay taxes from the carbon tax side of it rather than from income and wealth tax part of it. The traditional argument that comes up probably is that if we raise these taxes, the rich or the will start whatever, leaving the country or something along those lines. But I think I think that it has to be, I think the key word in that conclusion that you read also earlier is the willingness, the government willingness of entertaining a mix of policies, tax policies to implement a big program. That willingness then opens up a whole range of possibilities, discussions and technicalities that need to be sorted out. But if there is no willingness and there is a knee-jerk reaction to no, and there's then finding different type of excuses can be found, and supposedly some economically based arguments supposedly. But I think it's a scapegoating. It is if there is that willingness, if there is that recognition that the 25 years has led to the worsening of the income inequality. The country has highest income inequality in the world right now, with half of the population in poverty. That outcome, that benefit that the upper class has gained over the last 25 years, it's like saying that we got to do something about that inequality. Dealing with that how do you deal with the inequality in not in 100 years, but in a generation? And that is, I think, if that willingness is there, then I think it opens up with the negotiation, discussion, technical, objective, technical conversation, dealing with all these issues and addressing them, finding solutions for them.
Another question we have is, does the government have a macroeconomic model that they use to assess policy choices such as austerity, or does the government just base its policy choices on crisis management and what credit rating agencies want, which is fiscal?
We're moving away from basic income grants, I guess, to a broader question, it seems. They do, the government not, I mean, if you look at government, that's I think, Treasury and Reserve Bank, they have some modeling capability, Reserve Bank has, and Treasury has a conservative CG, computable general equilibrium model. The state of it, I don't know. It is, in my view, it's not a suitable model for that cannot deal with a lot of these different issues that we are talking about, but it is not across other. Like if you say, well, that Department of Social Development has a model to do this stuff, that becomes a different question. But they are not. It's not across. The modeling capability is not even across government departments. It is some capability within the Treasury and Reserve Bank exists, and they have used models and justified some of their policies over the years in that way as well.
There was an earlier question around the 18 to 59 scenario, asking why begin at the age of 18 and not at the age of 21.
Okay, well, 18 because 17. Well, you know, in terms of labor market, in terms of stats, it says the labor force. People in labor force are from 15 to 64. So unemployment. And employment is captured, the labor force is the sum of employed and unemployed, captured from 15 to 64. So if you look at broadly unemployed, it's larger than 8.7, 8.8 million because it includes ages 15 to 18 is 17 and also more than 59-year-old employed, which is about 2.5 million or something like that. We basically, the child support grant goes all the way to 17. So adult grant are from 18. There's no grant program currently for the adults. And it makes sense that the adult unemployment or adult grants would be, from 18, from where the child support grant stops, and to 59, which is where the after 59 when the pension, old age pension kicks in. So it's trying to capture, my understanding is trying to capture that age group that currently there is no social grant, except disability grant, which is for disabled adults, but no other grants. But it can be easily done in the modeling side of it. We can run scenarios on the age is a parameter in the model. It can be easily adjusted to just pick up from 21 up or what. That's easy to also adjust. I mean, that's another thing to say, that these scenarios, they all are adjustable, whether it's the amounts or the eligibility conditions. The modeling side, we can adjust the scenario. That's why I say that if the willingness is there, the technicality is the final formation of this, the final, eligibilities and entitlement conditions, the time when it will be introduced and how, all of that can be, through a process, sorted out. And the modeling can help that process to do simulation. The same thing when the child support was increased from 7 years as the maximum to 17, we did a whole range of scenarios. The minister wanted to know every year, what if it goes on, jump from 7 to 17, or if it goes from 7 to 8 to 9 every year annually, what would be the impact? We did a whole range of scenarios at that time to provide that. But at that time, already the decision had been made, the willingness was there, that they had come to a point that the child support grant had to increase. It couldn't be just stop at 7-year-old, it had to go to 17. And then the modality of it had to be sorted out, and that was done. here is, I feel I think it's a similar thing. It is that willingness, and the decision needs to be made at a higher level, and and then the modalities can be sorted out, whether it is in terms of discussion we had, whether in terms of age, whether it is in terms of coverage, or in terms of taxation, as we discussed earlier. I think those are just modalities that can be refined and finalized. And it doesn't need to be exactly the same thing from the beginning. Things can evolve, can be set to be gradually changing or evolving to a final form, and that can be easily done. Yeah.
I have another question around how does the government benefit from an income, from the distribution, of a universal basic income grant, not the citizenry, but the government itself.
How does the government benefit? Well, the government is my understanding is there to solve people's problems, the problem of poverty, problem of inequality, and they can, if they solve these problems, they can celebrate. They can say that's a successful government. It's a successful government. It generates employment, better living, safer environment for citizens, for business, for eradicate poverty. People live better life, happier life. That's the best reward that any government can get. They're getting paid to do this, to solve these problems. They get elected to solve these issues. So it's not the deficit GDP ratios that generates excitement among the people. It's about the living conditions. It's whether the opportunity for young, whether year to year, every year, whether people improve their life changes. That's I think that is the final criteria for for a successful government. And, yeah.
Thank you. And then I think our last question is, has any modeling been done on any ideal UBIG of, say, 6,000 to 7,500 Rand?
It was originally, we discussed it, but we didn't run that. It's possible to run now that we have the mechanism in terms of taxation side of this. So how it works in terms of the programming, all that, we have worked that out. But we did, it was some of the original discussion was that even higher than upper bound poverty line. But as you can see, the numbers become huge, large numbers, but yeah, no problem. I think it can be done. It's not a, we already had 9 scenarios and the baseline scenario, 10 scenarios to run and compare and contrast. So we limited to that. There was no technical at that point. We needed to, stop somewhere. Yeah.
I do want to note that we did send out a number of invitations to representatives from the Department of Social Development. So I just want to ask, is there anyone here in attendance today from the department? Because we did send out invitations just to give them an opportunity to speak from their behalf. If there is, please indicate with a raised hand or in the chat. In the meantime, I'll just be taking a final question from Duma there. Can we have a BIG with the job guarantee, since the upper bounded poverty line is only 1/3 of minimum wage?
Yeah, just about the. I made this presentation. There's a number of people from this Department of Social Development were present. The committee with Vivian Taylor, that Professor Vivian Taylor had with the ANC. There's a, they're looking at the basic income. So they were there and we engaged, and it was, so they have basically heard this presentation, a version of this, earlier version of this presentation about a month ago. So going back to what Duma was saying, I think if you're saying that as two separate things where you have basic income grant and some employment guarantee work, I think that's like EPWP, expanding EPWP. In that 6-pillar framework, as part of that social policy pillar, we have proposed and we have simulated in the model, also in the modeling work, the making the EPWP as the employer of last resort for the unskilled unemployed, not for all the unemployed, but for the unskilled unemployed. In that study, where we said, the government right now it's about a 1 million. The EPWP is about a 1 million, and while we have about 6 million, South Africa has about 6 million and more unskilled unemployed, and the prospects of job for this category is low, and therefore the EPWP should grow gradually to become employer of last resort for that group. It can be employer of last resort for the all unemployed, and pay, and in that scenario we said government pays 160 rand per day starting from current 100 rand to 160 rand per day for that. So I think it can go concurrently to different programs, the basic income grant, and the can be working in parallel with the public employment. If you meant it in terms of those who receive basic income grant, they also receive, I don't think that's what you meant. So I'm assuming you're talking about the parallel program for the, because not all adults, for example, if you're looking at adult basic income, not all adults are necessarily available to work or capable to work, unemployed. So connecting the two together is problematic. One can find, especially universal basic income where you have children and others. So I'm assuming these are two different programs. You're saying, can they go parallel? Yes, we have actually done that, simulated that. If you look at the second pillar and the impact, the discussion there in that framework, we propose that in there as well. The reason for it here is that the reason we had it, that 6th pillar, the rationale for it, that when you run scenarios and try to do a mix of policies and you keep trying different scenarios and low-hanging fruits, you run the scenarios and you still get some impact, but still not really making a dent in unemployment or on poverty, you keep pushing, well, what else needs to be done? What else needs to be done? And one of the things, the challenges was that even when we had increased investments in the economy, infrastructure investments, and all these other industrial policies and so on and so forth, you will see growth going, investment is going, but job creation was not there, and poverty inequality was not there, was not yet really getting significant change in them. And it was because the growth was not that much job creating as in the economy, as it is in the economy. It was not that much job creating. And the unemployed were also poor. So we had to, that social, that expanding EPWP as an employer of last resort was one of the measures, or the creating unemployment grant for the, or here basic income grant, was a way of, as the economy is growing, also at the same time being able to also accompanied with job, with supports for those who are being left behind, so that it doesn't leave, we don't end up with 5% growth, but huge number of the population left behind and still large portion of the population in poverty. So that's where that 6th pillar is, that combinations of these mix of policies. That's how we we added, like, for example, the making EPWP employer of last resort. It is not based on, like, Asghar thinking, oh, we have EPWP, why don't we make it out of nowhere? No, it is out of the necessity of the South African situation, where you can still get 5% growth, but a lot of people left behind and poverty is still being high. But if you're really trying to reduce, eradicate poverty or bring it down to really significantly lower, and that was for 10 years, over the next 10 years. This is, the one of the beauty of the big is that within the short period of time, it can impact significantly poverty and inequality.
Unfortunately, now we have run out of time.
Okay.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Adelzadeh, on behalf of everyone who had the privilege of listening to today's presentation. I know that there are a lot more questions that we can ask you, and I have quite a few myself. But now I'll be handing over to Dr. Vishwa Sadka to do the closing and way forward. Thank you.
So, comrades, since COVID hit across progressive society in South Africa, an argument has been made for a basic income grant. We've heard unemployed people's movements, we've heard trade unions, informal traders, including our intellectuals, the progressive ones, stepping up to intervene in the public debate around the crisis in our society. And our approach on the UBIG platform was not to sort of pin this down as a narrow proposition, but to keep an imaginary alive, to keep a societal consensus fermenting, and to amplify voices. And as Awande said at the beginning, that's very much the kind of activism and the kind of work we've been busy with. I also think that if you look at the objective realities in our country, the unemployment, the stress of hunger, and so on, all of this makes the case for a UBIG. We have a crisis of socio-ecological reproduction in South Africa, and it is impacting the suffering of the people. And so in this context, the animation is a resource for you to take back and to again diffuse, share, and engage more broadly with in your local spaces. Linked to this, of course, is the issue of the deep just transition. I'll say a little bit about that. Now, when we engage with Asghar, coming out of this work around a societal consensus, a lot had changed. The government was clearly on an austerity trajectory. It was very much about a conservative macroeconomic response to the crisis. And so it's in that context, various options that have been coming up in the sort of political consensus we're put up for discussion. And I think it's in that context, I think the realization was, how can we take this government on its own terms? How can we present a more compelling case and a more compelling technical argument? And I think Asghar has risen to the challenge in terms of the work he has done. And again, to echo Awande, a very, very big thank you, Asghar, for your work. It really moves the technical consensus debate to another level. I also want to thank Hein Marais, who also contributed to our thinking around how we connect the COVID transition to the deep just transition in the context of the climate crisis and the need to provide a cushion to society. And to move beyond just seeing this as a technical social policy issue, but seeing this as a crucial democratic systemic reform that will work along a whole set of other reforms to move our society in a progressive direction. Also to thank the IEJ, also that stimulated our thinking with their contribution on how we could finance this and breaking a whole lot of ground around fresh ideas, fresh thinking, and so on. And I think all of this adds up to the kind of technical consensus and that we now have to take on government and to take on the naysayers and so on. I think the other point to make is that what's come out of the technical consensus with all this hard-headed thinking is that we have an argument, a counter-argument to the austerity position of government. I think the technical modeling done and all the other thinking done really shows that you can have a feasible liberals, they don't have an argument. And actually progressive forces in this country have an argument. And so the key is to amplify this. And so we will be taking this to government. We will be requesting an engagement. We'll be putting this out into the media and more broadly into society. And let's see how this lands. The moment is now. Biden is demonstrating to the world that there is an understanding, at least in the centers of capitalism and imperialism, that inequality cannot continue, that you need a break with the social order that was constructed over the past 4 decades. And that's coming to the fore. Our political leadership and ruling class is still not there. But again, if we keep this work going, amplifying it, we can hopefully push the horizons of policy thinking. But we need to deepen the societal consensus, comrades. And so all the work that many of you have been doing, the Black Sash, the unemployed people's movements, the trade unions, the NGOs, SPY, IEJ, AIDC, whoever you are, the intellectuals, the progressive intellectuals in this country, whoever's risen and made the art around a UBIG now, please take these arguments forward. Use the resources we've developed here, the animation and so on. Let's strengthen, let's deepen the consensus. Thank you to you, because it's all your efforts that have kept this imaginary alive, kept this proposition alive in our society. And finally, a very, very big thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation that funded the research for this project. And of course, Jane Cherry, Awande Buthelezi, and the rest of the COPAC team. Thank you, comrades, and the struggle continues. Take care.